Hello and welcome to this live podcast broadcast here from the Leeds Library as part of Leeds LitFest 2022. I'm Molly McGrath, the Projects Assistant at the Leeds Library, and today I'm here with Peter Hain. Peter was brought up in South Africa, forced into exile. He became a British MP for Neath from between 1991 and 2015. He served in Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's governments for 12 years, cabinet, and joined the House of Lords in 2015. His new book, Pretoria Boy, got here, charts his journey from his childhood home in South Africa, growing up with his anti-apartheid parents, to his own anti-apartheid activism and journey into UK politics, and eventually the House of Lords. So, hello, welcome. Thank you very much for.
It's a pleasure, Molly, and good to be with you.
So, I've kind of I'm reading this book, and a lot of the first section of it is about you as a young boy. And it includes kind of information about the political situation in South Africa and your parents' involvement in the anti-apartheid Liberal Party. And you use this phrase at one point to describe yourself at that time, which is politically conscious, but not politically involved. So I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about that and just kind of tell me what you mean by that phrase.
Well, that was really meant to describe the part of my boyhood from around 8 years old to 16, when my parents, young white South African born, were becoming increasingly involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and working with Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, and to the point by the early 60s in which they were the chief and notorious political activists fighting apartheid in Pretoria, which was still is the capital, along with Cape Town, but the capital of South Africa. And so the government was based there, the administration was based there, and that's where the apartheid system was delivered from. So it was, for radical activists like my mom and dad, it was a big challenge. And they were very unusual in that most whites went along with the system. Because it benefited them. They had a pretty well, almost a slave-like, but certainly servant class in the black majority, and had a very nice life and didn't really want to challenge that. So mom and dad, who took a stand and did so not out of any great political background. What is interesting about them and is that they never really decided, right, we want to end up right at the forefront of the resistance. They were just got gradually more and more involved, and some pretty unpleasant things happened to them and to our family. So just to answer your question directly, I was a kid and then a teenager and found myself increasingly supporting my parents, but was not in the front line doing things myself.
And I think what really interested me was that a lot of the information that you kind of include wouldn't have been something that you were aware of at the time. But then I kind of wonder what those conversations were like as you were growing up and as you were becoming increasingly politically aware. What was it like to talk to your parents and to kind of discover the extent and the scope of the role that they played in the politics at that time?
It's an interesting question, Molly, because it's not one that I've thought a lot about in a way. I wasn't kind of thinking at the time. It was just, that's the way life evolved. And I describe, I hope well in the book, how they were a combination of, we had a normal life and an abnormal life coexisting alongside each other. So none of my school friends, who were all white, because you couldn't go to a school that wasn't all white under apartheid, schools, like everything else, were racially segregated. None of my school friends had activist parents. So we were abnormal, and my mom and dad were abnormal. But at the same time, my school friends also saw the other side, the parental side of them, of being great fun, of helping us with our various sort of bike races and things like that, that we organized. And to me, they were great parents because they were so supportive, whether it's school or whether it was supporting us in sporting activities, school sporting activities and so on. And at the same time, they were doing very, very brave things and sacrificing in the end everything that they had.
I think that kind of the way that you write about them, which such kind of admiration and affection really comes through. And what I liked about this book was that it's kind of autobiographical and it tells your story, but it's also this kind of portrait of the politics of the country. And one of the most affecting scenes is when you describe this trial of your family friend, John Harris, I think.
Yes.
And you describe it in this kind of forensic detail, as if you weren't there because you were a young boy and your parents weren't there because they were at the time banned. So I'm wondering why it was important to you to describe that trial with almost as much detail as the two later trials in this book, which of course were your
affecting
own.
me. Because it was a pretty central event at that time in South Africa, and it was very central and traumatic to us as a family, because he was a young teacher with a newborn baby and married to a teacher. They were both young activists, a little younger than my mom and dad, but family friends. And suddenly he got involved in a group out of desperation, because at that stage, Nelson Mandela and the leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle, his close comrades, were all locked up on Robben Island or elsewhere, issued with banning orders, which both my parents were, which meant you couldn't take part in political activity, you couldn't meet more than one other person at a time. And so, if your relatives suddenly turned up en masse to visit you, you were committing an offense for which you could be arrested and imprisoned. So he felt, with a lot of the anti-apartheid organizations banned, that's to say made illegal, like the African National Congress was, Mandela's ANC, and others, that he became increasingly desperate. And he felt that operating within the law and conventional political campaigning just invited greater repression. People were put in jail, they were tortured, they disappeared because of the police state, or they were issued arrest and intimidated. And that's what led him, I don't agree with what he did, and my parents certainly didn't, to plant a bomb on Johannesburg railway station. And he put it on the station concourse, and he telephoned a 15-minute warning to the police, which they deliberately ignored, because it suited the high priests of apartheid, the rulers, the ministers, the head of security, and so on, to actually have that bomb go off and kill people, which it did. He wanted the station cleared and a spectacular explosion, which would sort of show that the resistance still had some punch in it. Instead of which, they deliberately didn't clear it, and an old woman was killed, her granddaughter was maimed, and a lot of other people were injured, and he was executed himself. So I described that because this is a close family friend, and one who, had a breach with my parents in terms of what they did, because my dad felt particularly it would be futile and it would invite greater repression. And it did all of those things.
Yeah.
And it ended John's life. So I go into it in some detail. I hope it's gripping in the way that it's written, but it's also quite traumatic.
Yeah.
One of the passage I put in there too, which I did quite a lot of research on, about what it is like to be hung by the neck and executed, and the whole grisly business, which of course, hanging was only abolished in the 1960s in Britain by a then Labour government, and it still operates places like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the world. But it is a horrible, as I'm sure you'll agree, reading that macabre, forensic, if you like, description of what actually happens. And I thought about putting that passage in, having researched it, and I thought, yes, it should go in, because people need to know what happens.
Yeah.
When you're executed by hanging.
Yeah, no, I think for me that was definitely one of the most affecting passages of the book. And then of course you as a young boy went to that funeral, and actually talking about that, where you describe the hanging, you also have this one section in after the funeral where you talk about going back, and the kind of the crematorium guy talking about burning these bodies after, you had, he wasn't aware that you had to kind of like read this funeral service and then push the button for this family friend to kind of be cremated. And it kind of, in a quite blasé way, talking about the kind of, difficulties of, if there are too many obese people, and how difficult that was.
I know it was. I mean, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
When I went back to the crematorium, to the chapel where the service was held in 1965, on the 1st of April 1965, and it looked just the same as I remembered it a long time, over 50 years before. But then I was just interested what happened to the body afterwards. So I just asked. I didn't expect then to have a kind of blow-by-blow account of really quite unpleasant detail, including that, he was complaining, as you said, that there were too many obese people and that it was making his life difficult, and it would blow fuses, and people had pacemakers in which weren't taken out and the whole system would blow up and things like that. But I put it in because I just thought, it would be interesting to people.
Yeah.
But in a sense, that's not what the book's about. The book's about brave people, including John Harris, and I think including my parents as well, of course, as Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and all those great heroic figures who sacrificed so much. But when you think what my mom and dad did, my dad ended up losing his job, losing his income, and with 4 children, we had to be forced into exile to come and live in London, where friends helped pay for the fare, the travel on an ocean liner, because it was by far the cheapest way to do it in 1966 compared with air travel, which was relatively very expensive. It's the other way around now. But so, we left penniless and we stayed with a friend. And my dad, the only thing we had was a job. Now they gave up everything. They weren't able to go to their mum and dad's funerals because they were, as band people, they came out on a one-way exit permit. And there were lots of, you probably have struck you as well, kind of sides to apartheid, it was both brutal, but also it was, it was comical in some ways. So, for example, I tell the story of how my mother was banned in 1963. And one of the many, many clauses in pages and pages of a banning order designed to basically turn you into a non-person and certainly not able to take part in public or political activity, was that you could not marry another banned person. Sorry, you could not communicate with another banned person. This was designed to suppress the resistance. So when they banned my dad a year after they banned my mother, they were faced with an embarrassing dilemma. They'd never banned a married couple before, and they had to be given special permission to talk to each other as married. Special clauses in their banning orders allowed them to talk to one other banned person on the planet, which was each other. And that also, it showed on the one hand the way apartheid and the architects of it infected every corner of life. From sex to sport. You couldn't marry anybody or have sexual relations with anybody who wasn't white, if you were white. Who wasn't your same racial group. It was actually against the law, and people were locked up for doing it.
Well, this kind of, I guess, that seemed quite surreal, and this kind of surreal and bizarre.
That's a good description, yes.
Yeah, this aspect of not only in South Africa, but when you come to the UK as well. And I want to ask you about your, the other 2 trials which you describe in this book. And one was when you were a really young man, actually, you were put on trial for conspiracy, and then the second one I think you describe as a kind of Kafkaesque nightmare. And it did seem surreal to me, this kind of, the way you described it, this kind of manipulation of information in the way that it can be so easily kind of corrupted by people in power, and whether that's the media or MI5 or a judge, or that kind of really struck me. So I wanted to ask you about those kind of trials and how they felt.
Well, perhaps if you allow me, Molly, what I'll just do is set a brief context for them, because people now take it for granted that the anti-apartheid struggle was victorious and that apartheid was ended and Nelson Mandela walked free from prison and 4 years later became president of his country in the first ever democratic election in South Africa's history. But it was a really tough battle, and we were up against big forces. We're in a minority. I was vilified, not just in South Africa, where the subtitle of the book was the label given to me as South Africa's public enemy number one, which is what they called me, for interrupting their sport and stopping their sports tours by physically running on the pitch at Twickenham or Lord's Cricket Ground or whatever other sporting events there were, tennis matches and so on, because the teams from South Africa were white only. You couldn't represent your country if you didn't have a white skin. And those campaigns, radical campaigns of non-violent direct action, which physically stopped those tours, and they never toured again until Mandela walked free. And it really hit white South Africans hard. And they wanted to take revenge on me and all their friends in Britain. And there were many who didn't understand. I have people often write to me, even last week, saying, I hated you when you were stopping stopping my rugby or my cricket. And only now do I really understand why you did it, and I want to apologize, which is really decent of them to do that, actually. But it would probably be surprising to you, as a young woman, to imagine that the degree of vilification that was directed at radical protesters, interfering with sport, bringing politics into sport. We're accused of this as quite a current issue at the moment, obviously, with the Russian invasion, a terrible, savage invasion of Ukraine. But actually, it was the apartheid rulers who injected their politics, their discriminatory politics, into the heart of sport by saying, if you wanted to play, I couldn't play against anybody who wasn't white as a kid playing sport. And it went right the way up to national level. So I just mention all of that because I was then, immediately after we stopped the 1970 cricket tour, by this threat of direct action, having over 3 months invaded rugby pitches all over Britain to demonstrate against the all-white Springboks. After that, I was prosecuted for conspiracy to organize all of this. And it was a real political trial, funded from South Africa, although launched a private prosecution via an unusual, some might say eccentric, English barrister, Francis Benyon. But a lot of right-wing forces in Britain supported the prosecution, raised funds for it, and so on. And it was a pretty tough. I was a month in the Old Bailey, and I described the. I hope you found it interesting and startling, because it was. And in the end, I had to defend myself. I had top barristers. I was on legal aid as a student, but I had top barristers defending me and taking the prosecution case and examining prosecution witnesses. But when it came to the defense case, in other words, me putting my point of view, they said, look, the way the law on conspiracy is, you will incriminate yourself. And we will be asked, what is your client's defense in law? And we'll have to say, well, actually, he doesn't have one. So it's the end of the trial and off to prison you go, because the judge clearly wanted me to have a prison sentence, or so my barristers thought, and I thought that as well. So I ended up against these bewigged sort of barristers and all their might, me on my own with a solicitor and a few assistants defending myself. Anyway, at the end of it all, after a hung jury, that's to say the jury couldn't agree, I was acquitted on the 3 most serious charges, counts rather, which would have sent me to prison, and convicted for sitting on a tennis court for 2 minutes perfectly peacefully. So after a months-long Old Bailey trial costing thousands of pounds taxpayers' money, funded by the South Africans, as well, I was eventually acquitted. But it was pretty draining. And then the second one, which is actually completely surreal, I was minding my own business 3 years later in 1975, when I was suddenly arrested for a bank theft around the corner at Barclays Bank, where actually I demonstrated outside that particular branch because Barclays Bank was involved in propping up apartheid. And we wanted it to withdraw, which it eventually was forced to do. And I was arrested for a bank theft. I didn't even know it happened, and more or less framed for it. I mean, that's a rather crude summary of what happened. But I guess when you read it, you must have thought, did this really happen?
Yeah, it seemed very, like a novel or something.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it wasn't a novel. It was a very real life experience. And again, in the Old Bailey, this time for 2 weeks, and finally acquitted as well. Because in those days, if somebody pointed the finger at you and said, that's her or that's him who did it, what done it, there was no need for corroborating evidence. So as I described, the thief stole £490 worth of £5 notes from the cashier at Barclays Bank and ran down Putney High Street and went up one of the side roads and turned around and threw the money back to his pursuers, which is odd behavior for the thief, with a fresh fingerprint on it, which wasn't mine. So the police had a situation where the only forensic evidence conclusively proved I didn't do it, which of course I didn't. But they managed, after leaking the story and being on the front page of all the national newspapers and then the London Evening Standard, which was read by the back staff, they then stuck me, after all that publicity, on an identity parade, which is a pretty scary experience, as I say. And the cashier picked me out. So then they had the way that the law and identification evidence was changed after that you had to have corroborative evidence. But at the time you didn't. So once the cashier, who was a senior lady, pointed me out, she seemed quite frightened by the whole experience, actually, and admitted in court that she knew me from television. There I was on my way to the Old Bailey. Yeah,
it's interesting though that these two trials, obviously, by this point you're kind of a public figure, and that certainly, I imagine, was helped by the first trial and your quite public kind of disruption of these sporting events. But I wanted to kind of talk about that as a kind of a tactic that you used, because I think it ties into the ethos of this book, or one of the kind of the things that you mentioned quite early on, which is your kind of stance on activism in many ways is about kind of taking one thing and doing it. You're approaching this huge problem and you're really, you're taking one aspect of it, which is sport, and making kind of small concrete actions which achieve kind of real change. So I guess kind of, to bring it back to my first, the kind of the first phrase that I first picked up on, which is that, politically aware without being politically involved, or politically conscious without being involved even. I think that's a phrase that a lot of us can relate to in some way. A lot of people can kind of feel that they are aware of these causes
and have opinions about them.
But don't know how to kind of do anything about it. And so I'm wondering what you would say to those people, and how you think is the best way to kind of go from being conscious and wanting change to kind of enacting meaningful action.
Well, I think everybody could make a difference in their own way, and small things add up to big things, or apparently small things do. So I think everybody can make a difference. Not everybody is needed to become a national figure. I didn't expect that to happen to me, but it did. But there were thousands and thousands of people right across Britain who were involved in that movement. Probably 100,000 by the end at its peak when we stopped the 1970 all-white cricket tour. So I was just one figure, but I happened to be the person who'd conceived of the idea, found myself leading it, and became, as it were, the national leader, or the person identified as the most publicly known person. But I always say to people, first of all, about political activity, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, or whatever it might be, or women standing up to demand safe streets, or whatever it is. We can all do things that we can turn up at a march to say, after Sarah Everard was brutally murdered, to say, well, women are demanding that men change and give us, allow us to live and go about our lives without being harassed and, leered at and intimidated, and at the end of that chain, killed. So, I think that, and even other things like if you're a parent talking to your kids about the principles, that's important, because they're going to grow up in this world. So I suppose what my message in answer to your question, or summarize the answer, is that we can all do things in our lives that contribute to the total sum of change.
And I think it's that you were able to kind of come up with that idea because you understood that topic, and it was something that was really close to your heart, because you
mean sport?
Yeah, sports.
The apartheid sports campaign,
exactly.
As opposed to the campaign to economically disinvest or to stop selling arms to South Africa, all of which I supported, but were much more difficult to win on, because you're then into the big structure of the economy and people making profits and trade and jobs and all of that. And the whole structure of international finance and capitalism and so on. Whereas in sport, I knew I was a South African boy, as a Pretoria boy. I knew how obsessed whites were about sport.
Yeah.
And if we could hit them on that, because you see, apartheid was regarded as a pariah, and virtually nobody in the outside world would agree with it, or say they agree with it, or admit to agreeing with it. But the Springboks, as the representatives of apartheid on the rugby fields of the world, were lionized and given lavish hospitality and treated exactly the same as the All Blacks from New Zealand, or the Wallabies from Australia, or whoever might be touring. And so that gave them a legitimacy and a place in the world that whites could say, who lived a sort of a bit of a cocoon life in many respects, that's another story, could say, well, okay, we may be being vilified for our politics, but then we're treated as equals.
Yeah.
And not only that, but welcomed with open arms.
Yeah. Wow.
When we played cricket or rugby. So I decided to try and stop that.
Yeah.
And before that, the anti-apartheid movement, and I supported it, held placards outside Lord's Cricket Ground or Twickenham Rugby Stadium saying, "Don't play with apartheid, boycott the match," and so on. But nobody took any real notice, to be frank. And when we started running on the pitch and stopping the matches, then the balloon went up, then everybody took notice, and eventually, of course, we won.
Yeah. No, I hadn't, before I kind of read this book, I don't think I kind of appreciated how politicized sport can be, but also how effective political action is when it affects something that people really love and care about. And that is sport, I guess. And it's why those campaigns were so kind of effective.
They were, but also it was you could do something tangible.
Yeah.
I mean, we physically stopped the matches.
Yeah.
There were no more Springbok tours until the change happened. So that was a big victory. But, in the end, it's much bigger forces that changed, that brought down the downfall of apartheid, as I say in the book. But I suppose it goes to your question about focusing. I've tried to focus in over half a century in political activity on making a difference in specific things. So I'm I've done quite a lot in the House of Lords on Northern Ireland, because I'm really worried about the peace process there from the Good Friday Agreement. and don't want to see the clock turn back, and I think it is being. So that's where I suppose my view is, and it came from a conversation I had with Alan Paton, the famed of his time South African novelist and writer, when he said something to me about don't be an all or nothing person, be an all or something person. In other words, don't try to do everything and end up doing nothing. Try to do something and seeing if you can achieve something that way. And I suppose I've tried to apply that in my ministerial jobs as well, as 12 years in government, 7 of them in the cabinet. Try to focus on, they're all big jobs, they've got lots of responsibilities, but try to focus on certain areas where you think you can make a change, that you want to make.
No, that certainly came across in this book, and in, you can see how that kind of also developed out of the work of your parents. And I hugely enjoyed it, and I really can't wait for your talk this evening. And thank you so much for chatting to me.
No, it's very kind of you, Molly, and I've enjoyed it enormously, and I'm really thrilled you enjoyed the book as well.
Yeah, so yes, A Pretoria Boy, that's what it looks like.
It's coming out in paperback later in the year as well.
And it came out in August, is that right?
It came out in September last year.
Oh, okay, September, yeah. If you want to find out more about the Leeds LitFest, there's more information about the programme at www.leedslitfest.co.uk. And do you have a website, or you're on Twitter?
Yes, I'm on peterhain.uk.
Wonderful.
.org UK, I think it is actually,
Okay.
but I should know my own website.
You can Google these things, I guess. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Peter.